Hey, good morning. So, this is my Easter sermon. Um, it's hard to explain, but thanks to snow days and various other things, today I'm recording the sermon that I will be preaching here in the sanctuary on Sunday morning on April 4th. We're just, a little bit ahead in terms of our recordings. So you can save this if you're like watching this and it's not quite April yet. Just pause now, come back to it in a few weeks. Sorry, we just got off track and this is what happened. So we're still continuing our series through the book of Matthew, and I do hope to finish it one day, but thanks to the time of year, I'm kind of skipping forward to this part of the story. So here we go. And this year of all years, especially since we didn't have Easter last year. I mean, literally didn't have it. It was just the beginning of quarantine and lockdown and COVID, and anxiety was through the roof, and gathering would have been a terrible idea. So we're back kind of partway into semi-normality here, but just thinking of, the tomb and emerging to new life. I'm just having just recently gotten my vaccination. I'm kind of relating to this story in a different way, because I'm kind of imagining emerging from my little home cocoon and getting back into the world and experiencing all of those things that we've been missing out of. I don't know, it's just ringing differently this year compared to others. So I'm picking up the story in Matthew 27, starting with verse 27, if you want to follow along. Remember, our focus, we're still kind of taking the lessons from our series, The Story, where we tried to get a grasp on the big picture of the Bible story. We're using that same kind of approach throughout the book of Matthew and trying to connect things to the larger story. So, we're going to look at specific things that happen, but I always want to draw those back to the story. How is the story told? Why is that significant? What does that mean for us? We want to understand what Matthew felt like the first century church needed to know, and what he wanted us to know. And we want to know this version of what happened. It's important, and all of the details are important, and the things that aren't detailed are important too. So, start off, what's really crazy about all of this stuff, and actually I'm going to skip ahead through the mocking and Simon carrying the cross, and just get right up there onto Golgotha. So this is verse 35. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down they kept watch over him in there. So what does that sentence tell you? When they crucified him isn't even the main point of that sentence. It's not. It's like a subordinate clause or something. It's been a long time since I was in middle school English. So why is it that this incredibly important event is barely mentioned, and not even the key phrase of a sentence? There's not a single detail about the crucifixion part. There's nothing about nails and blood and spikes and thorns. It's just after he was crucified. And then the focus shifts. That's meaningful, isn't it? I know we would love to have more details, but Matthew didn't want us getting into the details and the blood and the pain, because that wasn't what the story was about, okay? Some of it, the casting lots, was a fulfillment of prophecy, but notice the soldiers sit down and keep watch. They're not even believers, not even Jews probably, but they're sitting there keeping watch. And pay attention to the continuity of witnesses. It's a big deal as we move forward. So there's people watching, people who are acquainted with death, who kill people regularly. They are there witnessing, and that's important. So that happens, and then we get the robbers, and they're hurling insults. You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. Kind of reminiscent of the temptation of Satan there, isn't it? And of course, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the elders, all of the leadership of Israel. Oh, look at that. What a king. Oh, man. Everybody's on him. He's rejected by the high and mighty, by other criminals being crucified. Sorry, I didn't say that right. By other people being crucified. Criminals, maybe the dregs of society who are being crucified. If you are, give us a sign, Jesus. Show us that you really are who you say you are. This has come up before, and Jesus had said, you're going to get one sign. It's the sign of Jonah. You're going to have to wait on that one. But here we have one, Israel is rejecting him clearly and very definitely, but also the idea of what a king is. You call yourself a king. See, they were sticking to a king is powerful, and a king dominates, and a king exerts his will. And Jesus is showing them that a real king will take suffering on himself to save others from suffering. That a real king will humble himself. That a real king will experience pain. It's a big clash between that cultural view of what a king should be and what God wants us to see a real king is. That's important. And then get down to verse 45, and there's darkness. This has always really tweaked my imagination. Just what was it like when it just went dark? You may have experienced the solar eclipse a few years back. My family drove to South Carolina so we could see it. And it was spooky and weird, and if it was anything like that, and I feel like it was probably a lot darker in this story, because it just felt like evening for us there in South Carolina. What was it like to suddenly have darkness during the day and to hear the sounds of people groaning or crying, just all the little shuffly things of normal life there in the darkness? Had to be weird. Darkness overcame the land. And that's reminiscent of a story from way back in Exodus chapter 10. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness will spread over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or leave his place for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. It's got that little last part. Those who had loyalty to God had light. Here in this case, nobody had light. It was just utter darkness, and it probably was the kind that forced you, they didn't have flashlights or anything. They couldn't just flip their phones and have light. They had to stay where they were. They were stuck, and it's as if the world had no connection to God for that period of time. Symbolically, perhaps so. So in that darkness, Jesus is really feeling the weight of his mission. He's feeling distance from God, feeling abandoned. My God, why have you forsaken me? For someone who was always so close to his Father, that's a powerful and heartbreaking thing to hear. And then Jesus gives up his spirit. Cried out in a loud voice. Gave up his spirit. There, verse 50. Curtain in the temple's torn. There's an earthquake. Rocks split. Tombs open. People come walking right out. And this is important too. Again, everything's important. So remember that the curtain was what separated God's part of the temple from the rest. It was the section that only some priests could go in sometimes. And so the claim that God was confined there was done. Clearly, that was destroyed. And I use that word very carefully because this was a precursor to the entire temple being torn down. It was kind of the beginning of the destruction of the temple, which Jesus had said, there's going to come a time when there's not one rock standing on the other. This was the beginning, a very symbolic beginning of that coming true. And so on seeing these events, this is verse 54. There's a centurion there and there's the other guards. They see the earthquake. They see these other things. They had experienced the darkness. They had watched Jesus during this time. And they come to the conclusion, surely, not maybe, not who is this man? Surely, he was the Son of God. That's a pretty striking exclamation from outsiders. But they saw what they needed to see to believe. And so, what we're seeing here, it's not, this is sticky stuff, but hold with me. So, the resurrection is not like something that happens, no wait, the crucifixion is not something that just happens so that the resurrection can happen. It's not just like a little, this has to go here because of things that come later. It was powerful in itself. Now, some people would get all into, when Jesus died, did that save us? Did that in some way atone for our sins? Did that open the door for God to forgive us? I'm not willing to get into any of that stuff, okay? Because there isn't any focus on blood. Do you see a single mention of blood here? Even one. There's nothing really about the power of the cross. It's meaningful to us because of what happened afterwards, but I don't think Matthew really wanted us to spend much time on that. He did want us to notice that as Jesus died, the power of God was breaking through into the earth. I mean, people were walking out of tombs. The earth was shaking. The temple began to fall apart, began its process of destruction. This was a powerful thing, and people were believing in him before he came out of the tomb. This was powerful in itself. And again, they were witnesses right there at the foot of the cross, saw him die, saw what happened, and they believed. And then, verse 55, many women were there, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. And this is interesting. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Those are disciples, by the way. So it's like, on the one hand, Matthew kind of downplays the women's role. And on the other hand, he's like, well, those two guys ran for the hills, but their mom was there. Here were these women keeping an eye on things. Continuity of witnesses. They were there, watching. And so what we've got, now again, when Jesus dies, he just breathes his last. When he's crucified, it's not even the key part of that sentence. It's just, where's the focus? On the cross and the blood and the power in the blood and are you washed in the blood? Here's what this is focused on. And again, it's just what Matthew is telling us. It's not me making any big theological statements. This draws together all the things that Matthew's been writing about the whole time. The big themes of the gospel. Jesus is the Son of God. That's clear. We see that. The centurion and those around the cross, they saw that. And when we when we realize that Jesus is the Son of God, that teaches us what a king really is. Remember the two competing versions of king? Well, if Jesus is the Son of God, his version wins. So now we know what a king is really like. And now we know about God. We understand God better when we realize that Jesus does represent the holy. And we know that God will take pain upon himself rather than punish others. That's not how earthly kings roll. We learn about God and his compassion and his love. The second thing, clear, is the rejection of Jesus by Israel/humanity. I mean, really, they represent people, not just Jews. And we learn something about people in the process, right? We learn about humanity, that sometimes it's the lowest, criminals being crucified, and the very highest, and thought to be the best of the society. All the people that you would expect to be the most devoted to God's plan were completely opposed to it. And support for God's plan, disciples, for instance, came from the unlikeliest of places. So we learn about humanity and our difficulty in grasping who God really is and who God wants us to be. Okay? So, that's two things. Then we've got the establishment of God's new nation. I'll put that in air quotes because it's not literally a country or not an ethnicity, not anything yet. But that centurion and those other soldiers from who knows where kind of represent the beginning of a new group of people that will be the spreaders of blessing. Israel has had its chance. They kind of blew it. This is a new thing that God is bringing up, his church, which will include all people. And those will be people not born into something, but who respond in faith to Jesus, his one and only Son. And of course, running throughout the gospel and all of them, Jesus as our model of righteousness. He shows us how to live, and he shows us how to die as a righteous person. An incredible example. Okay, and that's just the setup part. We're not even really to Easter yet. But big themes and important stuff just in the setup. And all of it matters. All of it points to where Matthew wants us to go. So now we're looking at sort of the in-between. And you notice verse 57, as the evening approaches. So there was a little bit of time. So there was all the things at Golgotha, and then that evening, some other things happened. Joseph of Arimathea makes an appearance. He's a disciple, a believer in Jesus, a follower, but he's also wealthy. He's connected to the upper class and maybe has pull that a normal disciple would not have had. He's able to get Jesus' body from Pilate. Continuity of witnesses, right? And he takes it not just to some random tomb in the side of a hill, a brand new one he had made himself. Who's going to get mistaken about a tomb that he had made personally? It's very specific. It's evidence. It's Matthew reminding us there's no way there was a mistake here. He cared for Jesus' body. He had a big stone that he had rolled in front of the entrance. Here's another really interesting tie-in. I love this stuff. Daniel chapter 6. So the king gave an order. They brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Ooh. Oh yeah, I bet people remembered that story when they thought of sealing the tomb. And so, Joseph does that and then takes off. He's not hanging around. He's done what he felt he needed to do for Jesus. And who's there? Verse 61. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. They kept an eye on things. And the next day, the chief priests, we find out, they heard Jesus when he said he was going to rise again. And they understood exactly what he meant. And they wanted to make sure that nobody did any fakey stuff. So they send a guard. That's good, right? We want evidence. We want clear proof. And let's make sure there's no hoaxes, right? That sounds good. Pilate wants them to make it secure. And they even put a seal on the rock. How about that? A little Old Testament action. So all this has happened. And then we're moving into chapter 28. Now, here's what's funny. I had never really noticed this before. But remember how crucifixion was barely mentioned? Well, the resurrection isn't mentioned at all. We never see word one about Jesus sitting up or taking off the grave clothes or walking out of the tomb. Not a word about the most important thing that's ever happened on this earth. I'm frustrated. Just want to put that out there. Not a word. So check this out. Again, totally missed this before, but I've been looking with new eyes. So here come Mary and Mary. They're going to look. It's sealed. You can't anoint his body. There's soldiers there. They're walking up there, and there's an earthquake. So they are present. The soldiers are present. There's an earthquake because, it says for, that connects the two things. An angel of the Lord came down from heaven and rolled back the stone and sat on it. But it doesn't say, and then Jesus walked out. He doesn't. I'm reading this thinking, he's already gone. The angel just rolled the stone away so that they could see he was gone. Read it for yourself. He didn't need the stone to move. It doesn't look like. Where was he? Why don't we have any details? This is driving me insane. So the stone thing, that was for the witnesses. And again, don't forget, the guards saw the same thing the women saw. I'm going to come back to that. And so the angel speaks to the women. Don't be afraid. That was the same way Jesus would talk to his disciples when they got shook up. Don't be afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus, who was crucified. That wasn't a past tense in Greek. It's not something that happened in the past. It's more of an ongoing, it's really more like you're looking for Jesus, the crucified one. He is the crucified one. He is and will continue to be the crucified one. It's not just a past thing. It's an ongoing thing. Come and see. You can see where he lay. He's not there. Notice you didn't even see him coming out. I just rolled this stone away so you can see he's not here. Go quickly. So once you see what you need to see, go quickly, urgency. Tell the disciples he's risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. Jesus had told his disciples before that he was going to rise and meet them in Galilee. The women would not have known about that. They weren't there. But, he says, there you will see him. Okay, I've told you. And so this is really neat. We've got the women being the first witnesses of the resurrection, the first ones to bear the message of the resurrection. And they get this commission, I guess, to go tell the disciples. So that's the scene. That's the resurrection scene. It's like 7 verses. 7 verses and not a single mention of what actually happens in terms of Jesus getting out of the tomb. If I was writing a story that hinged upon this happening, I'd make that a lot bigger deal. But it's Matthew's gospel, not mine. And so that's the story. He's risen. The angel said so. They saw the evidence, and that starts the rest. But then there's three more little pieces that Matthew includes. And so clearly, those are really important things. You don't add stuff to a story if it's not really important, right? Because you got to the key part. The resurrection really is the crowning glory of the story of Christ here. So the first thing that happens is the women, they hurry away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and were running to tell the disciples. So the women are being obedient to the command they were given, right? And what happens? They encounter Jesus. That seems significant to me. Would they have encountered him if they had just sat there and said, I just really don't know what we should do. I'm confused by this empty tomb and all the things that we've seen. Maybe we should just go get lunch. Should we go home? I don't think that would have come out the same. When we obey, we encounter Jesus. Isn't that kind of how it goes? We run into Jesus when we hear what he says and we do it. We get closer to him. I'm seeing that right here. They were, and so when they obey, they see him. And of course, what would they do? He just greets them. It's kind of like an everyday, hey, what's up? Hi. Like it's an everyday thing. They throw themselves at his feet. They're clasping his ankles like my kids used to do to me when I tried to leave the house. And they're worshiping him. And then he's like, okay, let's keep moving. Now, they grab hold of him. He's real. He's solid, not a ghost, not an apparition, not something in their mind. But he says, you don't want to stop here and just worship. You need to keep moving. You can't just set up camp here. And again, this is weird for a preacher to say, but we can't have all of our focus on being at church and worshiping, because this is just something we do to then carry those experiences to other people, to get out in the community, to run and hurry and share. And I see that urgency here. And he's saying, look, if they obey, then they will see me too, right? Go tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. There's also something kind of buried in there. Remember, the disciples had all abandoned Jesus and were largely absent from the whole passion story. Peter was out there denying Christ. John may have been nearby, but for the most part, they were gone. It's the women who were keeping an eye on things, the women who stayed close. And yet Jesus says, go tell my brothers. See, it's easy to miss, but the women got to carry not only the message of the resurrection, but a message of reconciliation, that Jesus still considered them part of the family. They were still part, they were restored in a way. And so, their brothers, it's the resurrection message plus agents of reconciliation. That sounds an awful lot like exactly what we're doing today, or should be doing at least. Then, little piece number 2. So the women are on their way. So remember, they saw something, they're going and telling. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city, they were also going, and reported to the chief priests what had happened. They went and told the story. But look at what happens. Oh, the irony. I mean, we knew the story had to go this way. We knew it. But still, it's still just like, ouch, because they set that guard to make sure there was no hoax. And yet the guard come back and they're like, there was an earthquake, there was an angel, he rolled the stone away, Jesus isn't in there. So that was an opportunity for all involved to say, okay, man, we blew this. He's for real. No, they're like, okay, we got to make sure that we tell everybody some people came and stole the body. We need to get a conspiracy theory going. It's always a good political move, right? Conspiracy theories are the way to go. You thought that was a new invention. And they give them money. And so again, they saw what the women saw, but their response was to lie for personal gain, whereas the women shared the good news, the truth, often at their own expense, and certainly for no gain. This was really important. It's important now. It was really important in the first century, where the Jewish establishment was very much peddling on their websites, and through the tabloids and all that kind of stuff, this idea that Jesus never really rose from the dead. Oh, it was the wrong tomb. Oh, it was some of the disciples stole his body. It was a mix-up in admin. Matthew's making sure we see that was not what happened. It happened. It's a matter of how you respond to it, right? And so he was making sure that his church could see the answer to that conflict right here. And then the last part, the very last, the end of the Gospel of Matthew. So the 11 hear what the women have said, and even though the testimony of women was not allowed in court, they believed, at least enough, right? Otherwise, they would have said, go away, we're busy crying here. They followed Jesus to the mountain he had told them to go to, and they saw him. They obeyed, they encountered Jesus. It's the same thing. And one of the great sentences, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. So, very similar to the women who apparently did not have that sense of doubt. But here's the thing. That sentence can read different ways. It's a translation issue. And, they had definitely believed what the women said in terms of Jesus being out of the tomb. They had heard the message of reconciliation and wanted to, kind of complete that process of reconnecting with Jesus. And so, even though they hadn't personally experienced it yet, they believed on the basis of testimony. It's almost like testimony is important. How about that? Why would that come up in a sermon? But listen, it could be worshiped. They worshiped, but some doubted. It could read that way, or it could indicate that the 11 worshiped him, but some of the others that were there doubted. That would be a reading, a possible reading. Or, here's my favorite one. They worshiped, but they doubted. It's not really super clear the way the Greek is laid out. So any of those are possible. But here's why I like that last one. This is the same word, that word doubt. It's the exact same word. It's not a common word. It doesn't happen all over the place in Matthew. It happens two places. One is right here, and one is when Peter sinks in the lake and Jesus pulls him out, and he says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And if you heard my sermon on that, then you know that wasn't like skepticism, like, I'm not sure about you, Jesus, but vacillation, going back and forth between fear and faith, wavering a little bit. So, aren't they just being people? Aren't they embodying us who worship but doubt, who worship but waver? I'm feeling like that's me. You might not like that term, but since you're home by yourself, you can acknowledge that without anybody looking at you funny. See, they're not skeptics. They're just wavering because they're humans. And fear is always there. And we find things to distract us and make us unsure. That's just kind of what we do. So the resurrection, this powerful event, didn't generate perfect faith, even in the people who walked with Jesus all the way through, who saw the empty tomb, who saw his resurrected person. It didn't create perfect disciples with no doubt in their hearts. The mission of the church, the point to all of this stuff back from the beginning of Genesis. The mission is entrusted to a worshiping and wavering community. That's us. It was them. It's us. And you can see that. I mean, could the Great Commission be any more clear in terms of saying, get out there and find people? It is an inclusive message. It's a message of equality and universalism. Go make disciples of all nations. How is it that we then spend 15 chapters of Acts with people like, gosh, should we share with Gentiles? Worshiping and wavering. That's the story, isn't it? Acts should not have been a struggle after that. But these weren't suddenly perfect people. They had resurrection faith, but that doesn't mean there was no wavering. We're human. It's just how we are. And so I just want to close making some points about the idea of resurrection faith, because this is what Matthew has been building to from word one of his gospel. This is the point of the story, okay? And one of the clear things about resurrection faith is it's not really about the evidence. There is evidence. There's a lot of evidence that Jesus was real, that the places he went were real, that the people he encountered were real, that he was a living person, that he had followers who experienced all this. We've got all kinds of evidence, but it's not about that. It's not about the evidence, because there were people in this story, we just read about them, who saw the evidence and came away opponents instead of people of faith. So it's not about evidence. It's not about believing that the dead can rise, because we heard Herod say, I think John the Baptist came back to life to haunt me. There were people who believed that, apparently these guards, they're like, listen, the tomb opened and Jesus wasn't in there. They had evidence that a dead person had risen. They didn't have faith. It's not about analysis and intellect. We use our brains. We are thinkers here. We want to dig into stuff, but ultimately, faith isn't about making sense of all the evidence and crunching all the data. It's a matter of worship, throwing ourselves at the feet of the one we believe to be the very representation of God. And that worship doesn't exclude doubt. It includes, and that's part of our journey. That's the more intellectual part, where we wrestle with the things that confuse us or don't make sense, and sometimes have to just say, I can't put those pieces together. And that's where we have to just have faith. There's some jumps the human mind can't make. And we have to be okay with that. It's actually very liberating, I'll tell you that. Resurrection faith comes from experiencing the presence of the crucified one, the risen Christ. Now remember, the centurion and others, they had faith in Jesus as the Son of God because of how he died. But you don't become a Christian until you believe in him as the crucified one, the resurrected Son of God. That's another piece, okay? And so our testimony about our experience of his presence, our testimony about his presence, both in words and in actions, how he's embodied by the church and how people can see the fellowship that the presence of Christ creates within us. Those are things that can give other people the opportunity to have resurrection faith. We see the power of testimony. We see the power of personal experience. It really never boils down to evidence. It boils down to choosing to embrace who Jesus is, recognizing he's the one that deserves our faith and that can save us through that gift. I hope that was at least thought-provoking for you. I enjoyed revisiting the Easter story through new eyes today, trying to get a fresh grasp on this stuff. It's certainly important, and the parts that aren't talked about much seem like some of the most important, but today we focused on what Matthew wanted us to focus on. May we be people known for our resurrection faith. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.